Hello, this is our Piyyutim class for Friday, January 11th. And today we're going to continue with 4 additional Shabbat Piyyutim. I'm going to go rather quickly. I don't want this to be a long video, so let's dive right in. This is Shalom Aleichem. Shalom Aleichem was originally recited in the home upon returning from synagogue on Friday evening in the Ashkenazi and Sephardic customs. And there is a practice actually of still doing that today, and that includes maybe in some customs repeating each of the lines 3 times. So if you ever encounter that, just know that that is a minhag. This was originally done really more as a meditation or a chant as opposed to a melody per se. And this famous melody that we know, Shalom Aleichem Malachi Hasharet, did much to not only make this a well-known text, but also to kind of get the Shalom Aleichem out of this domestic greeting kind of context and into first the Zmirot category, right, where it was sung at the table to this nice melody, and then eventually traveled into the synagogue as well, where in many prayer books of a more contemporary vintage, you'll find it in the Kabbalat Shabbat section, or maybe at the back of the book with the additional songs and hymns and this sort of thing. But the text itself was probably introduced by the Kabbalists of Safat. No surprise there. It does deal with some mystical illusions anyway with the angels, although they are rooted in the Talmud. And again, we're dealing with basically the same period, 16th or 17th century. The first time we find Shalom Aleichem printed is actually in 1641 in a prayer book from Prague. So part of what makes Shalom Aleichem so endearing is its literary structure. So let's do a brief analysis. You have in this poem 4 even verses with very consistent formulaic language. In fact, it's a repeated formula, just replacing the first word in each verse to kind of create a new scenario, as it were. And then also sha'aret in the first verse becomes shalom as you move along from verse 2 to 4. And the rhythm and the meter that we sense from this is really probably owing less to the syllable breakdown. I don't know, I didn't do a counting of syllables, but what gives it that sense of movement is more in the poetic elements, like alliteration and assonance and these kinds of things, and some of the wordplay as well. So for instance, in the realm of alliteration, I counted the mem 9 times in each verse, save for the 3rd verse, which starts with Barchuni. The lamed 9 times in verses 2 to 4, 8 times in verse 1. The chaf 6 times in each verse. So you have this kind of multi-layered alliteration thing going on that just helps push the language through and gives it this sense of rhythm. In addition to that, you do have also wordplay, which is, I think, very well known, right? The Malachi, the messengers, juxtaposed against the Melech Malchei Hamlachim, which is, the King of Kings and all of that. So the playing one against the other, sounding very similar, but meaning different things, that's a very clever poetic device as well. And then, of course, there's the assonance of the vowel sound of A, which happens all over the place. And then plos, right? Plos is repetition of words. So not only do we have this repetition of the formula in each verse, which creates the repetition of all of the words, essentially, except for the first word of the verse and the sharet, but otherwise it's all repeated. But you have certain words that kind of stand out even on their own, independent of this formula, to me anyway, like Malachi and Elyon and Shalom, just kind of ringing in the ear. Again, a very poetic device, which in this case actually aids the rhythm and the meter. So, where is this coming from? What is the theology behind it? Remember, every piyut, every poem really has a value, has a message that it's trying to convey. So this one's based on Shabbat 119b. This is perhaps no surprise. We've already discovered that Lecha Dodi is largely rooted in Shabbat 119a. So this ends up being a fertile ground for liturgical exploration, Shabbat 119. But here it says, Rabbi Yosef bar Yehuda says, two ministering angels accompany a person on Shabbat evening from the synagogue to his home, one good angel and one evil angel. So there we have that custom, the basis for the custom of greeting one's home. And when he reaches his home and finds a lamp burning and a table set and his bed made, the good angel says, "May it be your will that it shall be like this for another Shabbat." And the evil angel reluctantly answers against his will, "Amen." And if the person's home is not prepared for Shabbat in that manner, the evil angel says, "May it be your will that it shall be so for another Shabbat." And the good angel now answers against his will, "Amen." So the idea that they both have different views of the way things should be. The evil one wants things to be a mess. The good one wants things to be terrific and beautiful. But they each kind of agree with each other. They ditto with the amen, the desire, the prayer that things be this way the next Shabbat, and so on. So their ability to set their differences aside, their ability to basically agree with each other, even as they disagree, right? That's the basis of shalom, and that's why they become the messengers of shalom, the messengers of peace. And not surprisingly, the Kabbalists interpreted these angels as actually inner tensions, right? The Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Hatov. And interestingly, some have historically complained or opposed the recitation of the final verse, which starts with Seitchem, the exiting verse, as it were, because one should not hurry to dismiss the angels, citing Psalm 91:11, which says, "For he will give the angels charge over you to keep you in all your ways." But those who supported the practice actually pointed to Deuteronomy 28:6, which says, "Blessed are you upon your arrival, and blessed are you upon your departure," suggesting that all that is being said is that when the time comes that the angels leave, they will be blessed, but they don't have to hurry in leaving. So anyway, if you look at the entirety of the poem, it kind of does paint a scenario of welcoming and staying and leaving and all of this, which plays very nicely. Now, I mentioned that the melody had a huge role in sustaining this prayer. Maybe is odd on the subject of learning what the words actually mean for a reform or another liberal congregant, a more rational thinker, to look at this prayer and realize that it's about angels, because usually angels in America anyway are associated with Christianity or other New Age forms, but not necessarily Judaism, although there is, of course, angelology in Judaism. But the melody was so strong that it even came into common usage in liberal, rational forms of Judaism. The melody itself comes from Israel Goldfarb, who we could talk for hours about, but we're not going to. I need to wrap up on Shalom Aleichem as it is. But he was a Polish-born American rabbi and cantor and educator. His dates are 1879 to 1967. He was a graduate of Columbia University and also the Institute of Musical Arts, which was the precursor to Juilliard in New York. And also he was ordained at JTS and was among the founding faculty members of the Cantors Institute at JTS. And he also served as the rabbi of Kane Street Synagogue for about 50 years or so, actually more than that, 1904 to 1956. And among other things, he's considered a father of Jewish congregational singing in the United States, mainly through the Young Orthodox movement. I should say the Young Israel Orthodox movement of young observant Jews. That's really where congregational singing has its historical beginning in the United States. And he fed this movement with a lot of songs, and he actually became rather well known, maybe not by name, but his music. You may know his Vayechulu and Magen Avot and Zochreinu. I'm not going to sing them all for you because we don't have time. But nevertheless, this particular melody, Shalom Aleichem Maleche HaSharet, this comes from his 1918 book of Friday Evening Melodies, which he collected and composed with his brother, Samuel, who is an educator in his own right. His brother Samuel actually gave us the dreidel song. I had a little dreidel. But to put a long story short, one of the interesting things about this melody is that even in Israel Goldfarb's time, he would encounter people who actually thought that that melody was much older, that maybe it came from Sinai or their grandparents or their great-grandparents or the old country, and they would often sort of shrug and dismiss his comment that he was the composer. So that melody really caught on, and it's the reason why we're still even aware of Shalom Aleichem today, I would say. All right, so let's move right along to Tzur Mishelo. This also is mostly a Sabbath table hymn, both in the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic rites, and mainly sung as an introduction to Birkat HaMazon, the grace after meals, in many Jewish communities. The likely origin is that it comes from northern France somewhere. We actually don't know the name of the author, but probably no later than the second half of the 14th century, and spread fairly rapidly through the Jewish diaspora. Probably its original intent was as an introduction to Birkat HaMazon on all occasions, but because of time considerations, the Birkat itself is shortened on weekdays and on other insignificant days. And also there came the practice of just, setting Tzur Mishelo aside for Shabbat specifically, rather than doing it every day. The literary structure is pretty clear as well when you look at the text. It begins with an introduction that is often repeated, actually, as you move along. So I'm going to just pull it up here and see if we can identify some of these elements. I'm looking at the Zmirot database version, so if you want to look at that later. So this one actually does exactly what I'm saying. So it begins with Tzur Mishelo, Achalnu, Barchu, Emunai, etc. This bicola, and then that is often repeated at the end of each of the four verses, or 4 line verses, I should say. So you'll see that running through as the end of each of the 4 verses, sort of as an add-on or a chorus. And it's often done that way in practice. So there is a rhyme scheme. Each line consists of 2 short phrases. The first phrases end with nu, and the second with I, right? So you see that again because the Tzur Mishelo part, Emunai and Adonai, that's added to the end, but otherwise it's u, or nu, actually specifically, except for the fourth, where things change a little bit, where it's le, and then Adonai, and etc. So last one is a little bit of an outlier. We can debate whether or not that's original to the text or not, but suffice to say there is a consistent scheme, at least within each of the verses. Let's see. You also see that in verses 1 through 3, you have the first phrase. So each of the lines is really made up of 2 phrases. So Hazan et olamo, right? Ending with the O, and then Ro'enu Avinu, and then a lot of news ending the rest of it. And then that continues that kind of scheme with the O and the U and the U and the U, as it were. So that's part of, and again, specifically the new, the possessive ending being the rhyme scheme. So it's O, U, U, U. And then in the fourth verse, you have a little bit of a change because now things are ash and as you'll see. So anyway, you can tease that out. You'll see the scheme, but it's there. The rhythm also is not strictly even, as we see in some other Piyyutim. The rhythm, I think, is primarily attributable to the assonance here with the vowels, the O's and the U's in particular, also the E's and the Ah's, or the Na, as we come to the fourth verse. But anyway, as you listen to the examples, you'll hear all of this coming through as well. Let's see. So moving right along then, how about the theology? And of course, there are other poetic elements that we don't have time to get into. All right. So I mentioned that Tzur Mishalo is really sort of intimately linked to Birkat Hamazon. And in fact, 3 of the 4 stanzas are parallel to the first 3 blessings. In some ways, there have been practices of using shorter verses or shorter versions of Birkat Hamazon in place of the extended version, which is, it can go on, seems like a long time, right? You could make the argument that Tzur Mishalo, if it wasn't originally written as sort of a shortened version of Birkat Hamazon, in some ways it can function in that way. So if you're ever in a pinch and someone says you got a bench, and that was a rhyme, and I didn't actually intend it, but there you go. If you're in a pinch and you need to bench, you might suggest Tzur Mishalo. And here's why, actually. So 3 of the 4 verses are parallel, as I think I already said. The opening verse praises God who sustains and provides food for all living beings with grace and loving kindness, which actually parallels the first, the Birkat Chazan, in the Birkat Hamazon. The second blessing, which talks about the land, right, the Birkat Haaretz, here we have in verse 2, giving thanks to God for the gift of the Torah, the land of Israel, and the covenant. And then in the 4th verse, it's about Jerusalem and the building of the temple, our favorite subject, the Yibaneh concept. And this, of course, is found in Birkat Hamazon, interspersed throughout, but specifically in the 3rd verse, Uvenei Yushalayim, Ir, Kadosh, that kind of thing. So you'll see that it parallels very nicely Birkat Hamazon. Now, some interesting musical factoids about Tzur Mishalo. In the 16th century, there was a southern German manuscript that was uncovered, not uncovered in the 16th century, but uncovered from that period. And it contains musical notation of this Piyyut. So 16th century is actually fairly early for Jewish musical writings. It's actually very early. Jews didn't really start using modern notation to write their music until the 19th century, when things got a little more modern in Jewish communities. Things were passed along orally and so forth. So to find a version of a melody written prior to the 19th century is a rarity. There's only about 20 or so individual and collections of Jewish music examples that we have prior to that period in manuscript form. So, that being said, this particular tune was probably transcribed by a Christian and not by a Jew, and it was a particular melody that Christian person heard in in his encounter with the Jews of South Germany. And again, this makes it a very old example. In fact, perhaps the oldest existing manuscript of a table song, of a Zmirot, as opposed to other kinds of Piyyutim or liturgical, musical, textual examples. So let's see. We're going to continue then. And again, listen to it, and you'll hear some of these poetic elements coming through. If you have any questions about anything, we can take care of those on Monday. El Adon. So where does this come? Well, this is in the Yotzer benediction preceding Shema on Shabbat, including the festival Shabbatot as well in the Ashkenazi rite. In the Sephardic, there's a little bit of a variation where it won't be chanted during the Shabbats of festivals, but will actually be during the intermediate days of the festivals. So just a minhag variation. This particular poem is attributed not to an individual, but actually to a group, which was the Yordei Merkava, the riders of the chariot, these earlier mystics that predated the Kabbalists. Some say that they were active from as early as 100 BCE and then extending to 1000 CE. Who knows? Some of this is hard to tease out, but nonetheless, they were an early school of Jewish mysticism, centered on the book of Ezekiel's portrayal in chapter 1, 4 through 26 of this chariot, right? The heavenly chariot that was being driven by the likeness of a man, this vision of the wheel inside the wheel and all of that. But this is a very old Piyyut, one of perhaps the older Piyyutim that we have, because it was introduced during the Gaonic period. So we talked about Amram and the other attempts at creating liturgy at that time. And this one found its way in, probably a little bit after the first period, but I'm not sure exactly the date. It's fairly unclear, as it were. So this is interesting because there's something called El Adon, not necessarily the text that we have today, but actually referenced in the Talmud without the text. And the Zohar actually makes a deal out of El Adon. Again, really more mentioning the name of a prayer rather than the version that we have today. But that's the 13th century Spain. But of course, the legend has it that Shimon Bar Yochai in the 2nd century was the real author of Zohar. So at any rate, the vintage of this one is pretty early. And some claim, I'm not sure exactly the basis for this, that it's as old as the 2nd century, which would really make it perhaps the oldest Jewish prayer even in continuous use. That's debatable. But when we look at the text, we start to see some elements that certainly predate the conventions that will start to appear in the Palestinian tradition and the later Spanish tradition of creating poetry in a way that we would really recognize. It does have the acrostic, right, which is a biblical tool as well. The first Hebrew letter of each line forms an alphabetical acrostic, Aleph through Tav. And this is thought to kind of, whenever there's an alphabetical acrostic, as you may know, it's thought to show that God kind of created the world for the sake of Torah, and there's 22 letters which express everything that's possible, or that's the intention of, that's the symbolism of all 22 letters, that this alphabet, this Hebrew alphabet, has that creative power. That's the idea. That from the letters comes everything. A very mystical idea as well. But there isn't a rhyme scheme, which probably reflects this earlier composition. And what's symbolic in it is actually the number symbolism of words, counting words. I kind of joked around about gematria in our last class, but here it really does seem to be playing a part because the first two lines, El and Baruch, have 5 words each, alluding to the 10 words when added together by which God created the world, which is a reference to Avot 5:1, the 10 utterances, as it were. And the final 2 verses have 6 words each, which correspond again to the number 12, which is the 12 zodiacal signs, the signs of the zodiac. And then the intermediate 18 verses have 4 words each. 4 times 18 is 72. You know, 72 is the 72 names of God. Now, all of that might be a coincidence, except that there are variants of this text that are floating around. And in both Sephardic and Ashkenazi prayer books, where you find these variations, the number scheme is the same. So even as words are maybe substituted or there's some change in the language itself, the number breakdown of the 10 and the 12 and the 72, that is consistent. So that seems to be really the point of the poetry here, is to allude to these concepts beyond the text. And that's kind of the central meaning, in a way, is the numerical meaning. Theology, though, does come through. There's certainly a homage to God for the creation of heaven and its hosts. It talks about the sun and the moon and the stars and the planets, which is all really an allusion to the 4th day of creation, the lights and the firmament and all of that. And another interesting thing about it is in the penultimate line, there's this line that goes Sheva notnim kol tseva marom, which and actually it's low, but the low doesn't matter. So again, Sheva notnim lo kol tseva marom. All of the armies of heaven give him praise, right? These letters, the shin and the nun and the kuf, etc., these are actually references to the planets, the 5 planets that were known. So you have Shabtai, Saturn, Noga, Venus, Kochav, Mercury, Tzedek, Jupiter, Ma'adam, Mars, and again, the letters of the Tzadi and the Mim, and etc., the Sheva, Notnim, Lo, Kol, Tseva, Marom, all of the first letters of each of these coincides with a planet. So there's that astrological element there as well. The mention of the Merkavah as well is obviously an allusion to Merkavah mysticism. So there you go. And again, listen to it. You'll hear how it maybe isn't quite as even, although this is a nice little version that I sent you. Hope you enjoy that. Next, and finally, we have Anim Zemirot. Let me chant sweet hymns, also called Shir HaKavod, the Song of Glory. This one's ascribed to Judah He Chassid of Regensburg, who died in 1217. He was a pietist and a leader of the Chassidei Ashkenaz, not to be confused with the much later Chassidim, but this was a movement of Jewish mysticism in Germany, which is considered different from the Kabbalistic system. And he wrote books like Sefer Hasidim and Sefer Gematriot. There's Gematria again, but that's really a book on astrology proper, and some others. So that's a possibility. Now, he's not necessarily the author. I mentioned it's attributed to Judah He Chassid. There are other possibilities as well. Among them, Rabbi Shmuel ben Kalonymus HaChassid. The Kalonymus family, by the way, is a very famous rabbinic, poetic, philosophical family. You can look them up maybe when you do a presentation. Your Piyyutim maybe is written by a member of the Kalonymus family. But anyway, he was 12th century and was actually Yehuda HeChassid's father. So again, in that line. In the 16th century, beginning with the Venice Prayer Book of 1547, we start to see this poem adapted in various rites in the daily liturgy at the end of the Shacharit, but that custom really doesn't appear to be consistent with modern practice necessarily. There was actually some opposition to that practice because there was not enough time in a weekday service to do a poem so sublime and actually so long as Animzmi wrote. So it became more of a Shabbat custom. The Gaon of Vilna recommended that the piyut only be on festivals, but Rabbi Moses Isserles from the 16th century in Poland sanctified its use on Shabbat and festivals. So, where does it happen? Well, in the Ashkenazi rite, you'll find this mostly at the end of the Shabbat and festival Musaf services. Sometimes also after the evening service on Yom Kippur. It will be part of some liturgies. You might find it in prayer books. And also prior to the Birkot HaShachar on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur mornings, where, again, this theme of glory kind of resonates with the way that God is portrayed on the high holidays. Interestingly, it's actually customary in some minhagim to open the ark when this one is performed. And that's because there's an older custom, and sometimes this older custom is lost, but there's still the practice that remains of opening the ark, of the recitation of the last 4 verses of Psalm 24 preceding this particular piyut. And there, when you look at it, it's, let's see, it's, I guess, verses 7 through 10 of Psalm 24, which begins, "Lift up your heads, your gates, be lifted up, you ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in." This theme of, again, opening the gates and so forth, that is transferred in the practice of opening the ark. And it's usually sung antiphonally. So when you look at the prayer, as it's often included in prayer books, and I think the database has it like this. Let me just check. Yeah, so you'll see the 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, 3A, 3B, all the way through 15A and 15B, and then 16 and 17 are standalones. But for the most part, this is an AB kind of construction, and it's sung antiphonally to kind of reflect that, or maybe the construction reflects the practice. One way or the other, it's an antiphonal song, meaning call and response. So a leader might sing, and then the congregation follows. And that's why you have the couplets divided in that way. Conventionally, this is often led by a child. The rationale being that the child is pure of heart and without sin, and it's more appropriate for someone like that to sing a prayer of this type, which is really, kind of a celebration of God's glory, as it were. But also to get bar mitzvah boys involved in kind of practicing service leading. So there's the practical element in there as well. So let's look at the literary structure real quickly here. The structure is, it's got 31 lines. The first and last 4 are considered a prologue and an epilogue. So just to kind of contextualize the bookending of this. And it's possible that the first 3 and last 4 lines are actually not original to the poem. But that's neither here nor there. What we do see is from 5, if you look at 5, let's see, yeah. You have successive letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So you have your, actually, so don't look at it as the bicolas, or rather look at it as the bicolas rather than the A-B section. And you'll see that after a little while, once we get to 3A as it's noted on the database, you're into an acrostic with a kind of a smooth acrostic except for the resh and the tav being repeated. And then again, with the last four, it's sort of lost, the acrostic style. Again, as I mentioned, the beginning and the ends, the first and last four verses are sometimes considered, and it seems to play out with the acrostic. Those are considered add-ons or introduction and conclusion. So in the middle, you have this nice acrostic playing out, this alphabetical acrostic. So that's a very strong poetic element. There is a rhyme scheme. Each line consists of two phrases, ending with a rhyme. There is parallelism in these couplets as well. So for instance, if we look at the second, 2A and 2B, each time I speak of your glory, my heart longs for your love. Therefore I speak about you, about your glories. Your name I shall honor with my love songs. That kind of parallelism, again, kind of saying the same thing. This would be synonymous parallelism, reinforcing as it goes along. And the syllables, though, are actually fairly uneven, and you'll hear that even in the musical rendition that you'll hear if you click on that link. Yeah, so those are some of the poetic elements. I think we're running a little long now. I was hoping to end about 7 minutes ago. So let's just jump right into the theology. Here we have God being described metaphorically in terms of characteristics, and even more so in appearance. So this would be probably a good counter to something like Ein Kelohenu, which negates all physical kind of descriptions of God, but it's replete with biblical imagery. And again, the Bible, and particularly in the Psalms and the prophets, which this draws upon mostly, you see very free use of kind of anthropomorphizing the deity. And that seems to be reflected here as well. So there's reference, for instance, in verse 1 to the weaving poems and pleasant songs and that sort of thing. This seems to be a reference to specifically clothing. So you have the idea of the garment of honor, and that's reflected in Psalm 93:1, where it says, God reigns clothed in majesty. And continuing, because my soul longs for you, in Psalm 42:2, as heart longs for water, so my soul longs for you. So in some ways, these are quotations or reductions a lot of the way through of biblical references. Again, we have also this, I think it's in, let's see, the shadow. This is right in the second verse. My soul desires the shadow of your hand. This is a biblical metaphor as well. In Isaiah 49:2 and Isaiah 51:15, it both talks about the shadow of God's hand. So there you go. And let's see. I noted a few more here. Verse 7, where it's talking about the head being covered with the dew of light. I believe that's in verse 7. Yeah. So here it says, but only light reflects in the drops, talking about the curls of the black. Curls are as his curls, right? Curly head. It says black is the downpour at night, etc. So this dew of light, this comes from Isaiah 26:19, where it says, your dead will live, my corpses will arise, awake and sing, you who dwell in the dust, for your dew is like the dew of light, and the earth will bring the deceased to life. So anyway, you see that exact phrase, the dew of light, in there. And then just a couple more. In verse 8, talks about the finest pure gold is a form for his head inscribed on his forehead. I think you'll probably see that if you're looking I'm at the database. But here, that's actually Shir Hashirim, where it says his head is the most fine gold in Shir Hashirim 5:11. Verse 10, if you want to go down there, talks about his treasured people as a crown in his head. This is Isaiah 62:3. You will also be a crown of beauty in the head of Hashem and a royal tiara in the open hand of your God. Not a coincidence, I don't think, that Isaiah is playing a big role here. Isaiah, maybe more than other, I would say Isaiah and Psalms more than other texts, maybe you could throw Shir HaShirim in there as well, tend to be sources for Piyyutim for whatever reason. These are just kind of very poetic books that have a lot of language that's kind of begging to be used or referenced. And again, I think because Isaiah, as we talked about before, is sort of a witness to the destruction and all of this, that theme is always underlying, or not always, but most of the time, underlying these poems to such an extent that Isaiah sort of becomes a role model or a witness to not only the destruction, but hoping for redemption and all of that, which tends to come in and out of Piyyutim quite regularly. So I hope that was useful, and we did it at least close to 40 minutes, which was my, I wanted to do it within 30 to 40 minutes, so pretty close. Anyway, Shabbat Shalom, and see you on Monday.